This video will cover the setup of a LeadProsper direct post campaign. We'll start by looking at a completed campaign to demonstrate how it's set up. To set up a campaign successfully, you'll need your buyer's API specs. Here, we have an example of LeadProsper API specs for a solar campaign. Here you'll see the field name, the type and format, whether or not it's required, and a description of the field as well. The description will contain what information must be sent. For an example, a specific value as you see here for LP key, or a list of allowed values for the multiple choice fields. If you go to the Ingesting Leads section on your API specs, you'll see that the method for the HTTP request is POST, along with the URL, the header type, and example of the payload. It says here that the payload can be sent as either a form or JSON. Begin your buyer setup by copying and pasting the POST URL from your API specs and selecting the correct request method and payload type. It is important to note that if you change the payload type from JSON to form or vice versa once you've made changes in the payload builder, the payload will revert back to its default and you will lose any progress. So keep in mind that you should set the payload type before making any changes to the payload. The payload will contain the fields that are laid out in the buyer's API specs. Those that are in bold are the fields that are required. The first three static values laid out in the API specs, LP campaign ID, LP supplier ID, and LP key, are unique to every LeadProsper campaign and will need to be hard-coded into every payload. Since these are LeadProsper API specs, be sure to add the field LP action test so that when you test your buyer, the LeadProsper system knows that this is a test lead. You will remove this later after receiving a successful test response and before taking the campaign live. You'll then map the rest of the fields from the API specs to the payload. For example, the first name field will map to the first name payload. Although most of our field names match here, they do not need to match exactly as they can be field mapped. As we see here, monthly electric bill is mapped to utility bill and property type is mapped to home type. You can always click on your desired field from above the payload builder and copy and paste them in below. You can also add transformers to your fields. If you want to learn more about transformers, click the link above the payload builder here. Content type is the only header per the API specs. So in our buyer setup, content type would be the key and application/JSON would be the value. This is automatically filled out here based on the payload type selected above. At the bottom of our buyer setup, we have our response mapping. This tells the LeadProsper system whether the lead was accepted or logged as a duplicate. From the API specs, you see here that for an accepted response, the key on the left-hand side is status and the value is accepted. Below, we also see that the key and status for duplicated responses is status and duplicated. If a lead doesn't come back with an accepted or duplicated response type, LeadProsper will log that lead as a failed lead. To test your buyer, click Save at the top and then select Test Buyer. Generate some dummy data and then send a request. Once you get an accepted lead, you can copy all in the top right corner and send the data to your buyer. Once they've confirmed everything looks good, set your buyer to live. Be sure to remove LP action test from your payload builder before you go live. If you have any questions, please use the support button or send us an email at support@leadprosper.io.